Hello guys and gals, and this is part 14 of our reading of Pandora's Genes. It is a book by Kathryn Lance and part of a trilogy. It's the first book of the trilogy, the second book being Pandora's Children, and the third being Pandora's Promise. These books are still for sale at most of the major retailers, and so you can pick up your own copy. Also, we're going to go over the copyright information. I believe this is, if I'm not mistaken, copyright 1985. Here we go. Cover art is by Dave Mattingly, and all rights reserved, and copyright 1985 by Kathryn Lance, but I actually have the author's written permission to read this book on my YouTube channel. Now, in the last chapter, the women evacuated the old garden because the principal wanted to use it for a fortress because it was near the border and stuff like that. So all the women moved closer to the capital, to a compound, well, closer to the capital, rather. The principal is still intent on getting Evie, even though she is technically a daughter of the garden now. And he's probably going to find a way to do it too, but I don't know. Basically, when we stopped reading, he was on the way to the new garden, and it's 2 years later, and we're going to see what happens, because I don't know. I've never read this book before, but it's really a good book. I enjoy this. Unfortunately, the traders, T-R-A-D-E-R-S, not T-R-A-I-T-O-R-S, the traders' beliefs were taking hold in the capital and discouraging them consuming more energy every day. His subjects seemed eager at the least excuse to give up every vestige, not only of civilization, but of common sense. He had always had difficulty persuading the people of the capital to bathe, to dispose of their waste in places other than the drinking water supply, and attend the literacy classes, which he encouraged by forgiving a part of taxes owed. There had been more resistance to all these since the traders had come into the district, with their doctrines equating cleanliness with godlessness, technology with the devil, and knowledge with damnation. It was as if all of mankind had suddenly chosen to return to the Dark Ages, but this was worse because the knowledge existed, though it was no longer widely known of the consequences of poor hygiene. The principal knew from his reading that it had taken hundreds of years for a few forward-looking scientists to persuade their peers to accept the theory of the bacterial spread of diseases. That as recently as 2 centuries ago, people had died in great centers of healing called hospitals because doctors would not wash their hands. Today, the majority of the people in the district did not know the most elementary rules of hygiene. Did not know the most elementary rules of hygiene, and those who had heard of them avoided them as evil mistakes of the past. The theory of disease was well known to the principal and Zach. As young boys in the garden, they had looked through ancient microscopes at the small creatures which lived in the drop of sweat or pus, and even in well water. At the time, both the principal and Zach had been terrified of the small creatures, thinking them the personification of wild demons. It was only their systematic education in the garden which had prevented the principal and Zach from succumbing to the same superstitions and fears which made the lives of most citizens of the district more miserable than necessary. In one respect, only had the situation improved. After being repulsed several times by the soldiers of the old garden, the traders had given up armed attacks anywhere in the outlying part of the district. I'm going to have to read that again. In one respect, only had the situation improved. After being repulsed several times by the soldiers at the old garden, the traders had given up armed attacks anywhere in the outlying part of the district. The principal liked to think that their militant arm had been defeated, but it seemed more likely they had simply changed tactics. Another Western expedition would have to be mounted sooner or later to find the elusive heart of the traitor empire and cut it out. At least he wouldn't hear traitor nonsense at the garden. Perhaps this thought accounted for his strangely buoyant mood. Not only of his men sharing, not one of his men shared his concern and goals in the same way Zach had. Not even Daniel, the best educated of his generals. There was no one he could discuss these things with, really, except for the women of the garden. There was a sharp smell of wood smoke, and his field headquarters, which guarded the neck of the peninsula, appeared. Leaving his escort, he rode the few remaining miles alone. Again, he tried to guess why the women might have summoned him so urgently. He realized he should long since have paid a courtesy call. Still, he doubted they expected courtesy of him, and on his part, the thought of seeing the old woman again constricted his throat with remembered rage. He could still see her hateful, gloating face in the firelight the night she had informed him that Evie had become a daughter of the garden. The image of the girl with her astonishing eyes had appeared to him often in dreams and reverie. It was a neat trap. He owned her. He was certain of it, but he could never, without abandoning his great concerns, have her. He spat as if to remove a bad taste. Well, 2 years had passed, and no doubt she would now be too old for his needs. Seeing her again would be just the thing to rid him of his desire for her. His compulsions, in any case, seemed to come upon him less and less in the time since the move. He had had very few girls, none now for several months. In the mornings, when he looked into the mirror, he saw gray strands in his hair. Perhaps he was at last maturing, outgrowing the ruinous obsession that had controlled him for so long. The new garden had been transformed since he was last here. His men had repaired all cracks in the walls and the houses, and the women had planted and tended the gardens and orchards. Though the crops had long since been harvested and the ground was bare, save for stubble and brown leaves, there was a feeling of vitality and growth here. The principal stood by the gate, whilst the guard, a heavy, awkward girl with a shallow complexion, ran off to summon the mayor. The late fall breeze brought the fresh scent of fish and salt from the bay, and he breathed in deeply, remembering again the week that he and Zach had spent here planning their final assault on the capital, knowing that this time they would succeed or die. It was astonishing how memories of Zach continued to turn up unbidden. 3 years since his death, in spite of the finality of the burial, the principal still found himself listening for Zach's quiet knock on the private door to his office, or for the haunting music of his feathered lyre. The principal wondered if he would ever stop missing him. He was brought to himself by the sound of a door slamming. A familiar figure crossed the wooden porch and strode along the carefully tended path. "Good day to you," said Katha, her face carefully expressionless. "And to you. The mistress is anxious to speak with you. After you've cleaned up and rested, I'll take you to her." Without another word, she led him around the great stone house to a small wooden outhouse. The mistress's room was in the basement of the main house. Like her old cabin, it was dark and stuffy, dimly lit by flickering fish oil lamps. The old woman was lying on a long wooden cot, bundled in blankets and propped up with pillows. She looked as if she had aged 10 years in the 2 that she had been living here. Her skin was yellowed and hanging in folds. Even her eyes seemed to have lost their fire. He was shocked and tried not to let his face show it. "Good afternoon, Will," she said, as if she had last seen him just a day or so ago. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'm sorry to see you're not well." She snorted. "It's obvious that I'm dying, though I don't know how long it will take. It's some form of cancer, I think. They could probably have cured it before the change, but I don't mind. I've lived for far longer than I ever expected to. He felt strangely moved by the news of her approaching death. At other times in his life, she had wished for nothing so intensely, but now it hurt to see her so obviously weak and sick. "This is why you summoned me?" he said. She shook her head impatiently. "I can die very well without your company." He held in his anger. Pity for her pain restrained him. She continued, her voice surprisingly strong. "I called you here because we need your help. I must explain some things to you myself." He relaxed. It was to be a matter of business, then. In other matters, except for brief moments, usually with Zach's intervention, they had never communicated except through a veil of mutual irritation. Her face clenched, then, as a wave of pain passed over her, and he looked away until it had passed. The room was more cluttered even than the old one. From the dust on the instruments and books, he guessed she had been too ill to work for some time. "This new site has worked out well," she said, as if from a great distance. "At first, as you know, we objected to having your soldiers stationed so close by, but in the long run, it has proved convenient in many ways." "So I hear. You've heard that some of our women have mated with the soldiers, and that is true. It was most inconvenient for us to move when we did, and lose the services. Sorry, I got tongue-tied on that. So you've heard some of our women have mated with the soldiers, and that is true. It was most inconvenient for us to move when we did and lose the services of the local men." So maybe they knew the highwaymen. "But your camp provided us with a far greater selection for our breeding experiments." She paused, then raised her head and moved it towards him. Automatically he leaned down, his eyes going to her thin lips to help him understand what she had to say next. "We believe that we have taken the first step in eradicating the woman's sickness." "What?" She nodded several times. Her lips smacked together between words as she continued. "We were working on it when you forced us to move. That was one reason for our opposition, though we could not tell you then. Do you remember the large number of women who were pregnant when you came to the garden 2 years ago? At the time, it seemed unusual. We've long known that the illness is sex-linked, passed on by both parents, but attacking only women. As you know, some women develop it early in life, and some never do, and usually it kills a woman and her child upon the birth of the second daughter." The principal frowned. As I remember it, the trait is believed to be carried on the female sex chromosome. Yes, the X chromosome. As nearly as we can tell, only those women who have received the trait on both their X chromosomes have ever actually developed the disease. But those who have received the trait from just one parent could pass it on to their children? She nodded. Since men have only one X chromosome, any man who carries the trait still passes it on to each of his daughters. A woman carrier's children will have a 50-50 chance of receiving it from her. She lay back and rested a moment, then went on, almost briskly. All of this has been known or assumed for years. What we did not know was how the disease actually operated. About 4 years ago, old Allison got the idea that the disease was autoimmune, that somehow the women who became ill were reacting to something in femaleness itself, that the first affected girl child would set up the sensitivity, and the second caused the illness to appear. Allison developed a serum from the blood of women who had died of the sickness, and we tested it on all the members of the garden. Those who had more than one daughter did not show a reaction, but many with one daughter or no children or only sons developed a swelling at the site of the inoculation, meaning that they carry the trait. We can't be sure that the test shows carriers. but we are becoming quite certain that it indicates those women who have the trait on both X chromosomes. She raised herself to her elbows, her pale eyes glittering with excitement. Will, since we began testing, we have allowed no women to mate except those who show no reaction to the skin test. There have been 36 normal pregnancies in that time, half of them of girl children, and no one has died of the sickness. She lay back, her face exhausted and triumphant. The principal caught her excitement. The details would have to be worked out, but clearly this work held the answer to the greatest threat ever to face humanity. Leaping into the future, his imagination saw that cooperation between him and the women of the garden would indeed change the course of history, and that his name in future books would not be a footnote, but would be written large as the savior of all mankind. So lost was he in this dream that he had to ask the old woman to repeat what she had just said in her feeble voice. "This is only the beginning," she murmured. "We still need a method to discover which men are carriers, and why, indeed, the trait doesn't extinguish itself. At present, we can only be certain of those few men who do not share a wife where she has died of the sickness." Zach pointed the way first to that. The principal nodded, although he had long since forgotten the garden with Zach when Zach's wife died. He knew that Zach had pored over the available information, finally abandoning all study and the garden after satisfying himself that he was a carrier and that the death had in truth been his fault. "For now, we are ready to begin testing the general population," she continued. "We'll need your help. All my resources are yours. My scientists have already drawn up plans. They'll explain everything to you in detail." She paused and went on, speaking very distinctly. "I wanted to talk to you myself to get your pledge to fully protect any women who go into the capital." "Yes, of course. Protection in every way," she replied, "and above all, from yourself." He shook his head angrily. "No promises, old woman. Listen to me," she said. "What's between us is in the past. I know I bear some responsibility for your hatred of women, but this is much more important than the way either of us feels. We are finally on the verge of an answer. Trouble between you and the garden would destroy that. Katha is strong and a good leader, but she doesn't fully understand how important the work is. Don't do anything to jeopardize it. Promise me." He had to stand. He walked to the window and parted the curtain, then looked out at the white November sky. He took 3 deep breaths, letting them out slowly, and then returned to the old woman's bedside. "I promise," he said. "There is no choice." "I know you will keep your word," she said. She settled back into the pillows as if completely exhausted. She seemed to slip into sleep, and he wondered what to do. When her eyes flicked open again, "You must meet with the women who will work in the capital. All have volunteered, and all understand the possible dangers. They are irreplaceable, Will, as is your knowledge. Guard them well." He nodded. "My men will protect your girls with their lives. Rest easy, old woman." She laughed weakly. "Don't bury me too soon. I've some time left yet." Her eyes clouded. "I've been very lucky to live to see the goal of my life nearly reached. If only," she looked at him, her face full of sorrow, "if only Zach could have lived to see it too." He felt contaminated by the old woman and her stench of illness. Although he had intended to stay here the night, he could scarcely wait to return to the military compound where he would sleep among men in the clean air. There remained only the meeting with the scientists who would come to the capital when he had worked out the details. All would, of course, be fanatical daughters of the garden, humorless and sexless. He followed Katha to the lab, cluttered as the old one had been with the odorous animal cages and strange instruments. He opened his mouth to speak, then stopped, waiting waiting with the other two scientists and looking more beautiful than she had as a very young girl, was Evie. She had grown tall, and her woman's figure was evident even under the loose-fitting lab coat. She was a young woman now, nothing like the flat-chested, innocent girls he had always preferred. It didn't make any difference. He wanted her so intensely that the feeling made him dizzy, and he understood at once why the treacherous old woman had extracted his promise at her sickbed. Chapter 2. The principal felt irritable as he approached the capital. Although he had been away fewer than 36 hours, it seemed longer. The dirt, the noise, the stench were overwhelming. As soon as he crossed the still-standing pre-change bridge with its concrete pilings and rusted supports, he saw the heaps of refuse piled carelessly all around the riverbank. The crumbled pre-change roadways were crowded with merchants and farmers taking their wares home on carts drawn by draft animals. Most of the men were dirty and shabby, drinking their home brew from flasks, shouting, arguing, relieving themselves in the street. At every crossroad, ragged young boys solicited, selling themselves for the price of a meal or a cup of brew. Above them all stood the ancient buildings, crumbling and dingy like crude caricatures of the shining marble structures shown in pictures from before the change. 3 generations ago, this had been a thriving metropolis, a center of the highest civilization mankind had ever achieved. Now, most living was clustered by the river and its tributaries, a stinking, concentrated mass of humanity with all its problems. How could he hope to restore civilization when barbarism was so close to the surface? Was it even worth it to try to clean up and educate these dirty, wretched men and women with their rotten teeth and sallow complexions? Even as he thought of the difficulties that faced him, his mind was working on the immediate problem of establishing clinics for the testing of women and for the vast project of birth control education that would follow. Automatically, he reviewed government buildings that could be used. The scientists from the garden would stay in the pre-change mansion across from his own great house. They would be safe there, and he could keep an eye on them. At the thought of the women, his anger rose again, sickening him. Evie would be as close as his stables. He might see her every day, and he had given his word to stay away from her. As the principal and his men turned off the broad avenue toward his house, their mounts were jostled by crowds leaving the closed markets of the mall. Some men recognized him and turned to wave or to call out, begging for a special favor or an audience. Usually he stopped and spoke to his people, but he was tired and irritable and wanted as little contact as possible with the unhappy subjects, who were his chosen responsibility. At the park just across from his house, a large crowd was gathering around a man standing on a crate. He was dressed in filthy leather garments, but was clean-shaven and spoke with obvious passion. Surprised at the size of the crowd, the principal turned to watch a moment. Very quickly, someone recognized him and called out his name. The man stopped speaking and looked directly at him. For a moment, their eyes met, and the principal felt a chill go through him. He paused in confusion, now certain what to do. History taught that freedom of speech was an important outlet in any society. Take away free speech, and you're guaranteed to spread the spread of dissonance. But there was something frightening about this man. His look, his passion, and the attention of the listeners. The principal turned to Daniel, intending to ask him to find out who the speaker was and what he was doing there, but suddenly the crate was empty and the crowd was dispersing. The next instant the principal heard shouts and a shrill whistle across the street at the entrance to his house. He turned and saw men running toward the porch, his heart thumping. He slapped his mount as quickly rode through the wrought iron gate. He jumped off his mount, handing the reins to the frightened-looking stable boy, and ran towards the bushy, bearded guard. "What's going on here?" The man began to stammer. the great library, sir. Someone has got into it with a fire. A fire in the library? Will ran up the stairs and along the carpeted corridor to the library. There was a sharp smell of smoke, excited shouts, and the sound of men running. Through the haze, he saw several guards beating a struggling figure in the doorway. At that moment, Robin rushed up to help. "Thank the Dinas you're back," the old secretary cried. Will pushed past him into the library. The smoke was still choking. In the center of the room stood a large pile of ancient books, blackened and now sodden from the water that had been poured on them. The magnificent blue carpet had been ruined. Glancing quickly at the shelves, he saw that the damaged books represented only a fraction of the many stored here, but his stomach still turned over at the thought of any damage to the irreplaceable knowledge of the past. He turned back to the door, where Odell, the housekeeper, was cowering. "Have someone clean these books and save what they can be saved. Dry the pages that can still be read. Put as many men on it as necessary. Now." Trembling Odell set off to recruit workers. We are going to have to stop that there. We've been reading Pandora's Genes. It is a book by Kathryn Lance, and the first book of a trilogy. The second book being Pandora's Children, and the third book being Pandora's Promise. If you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe, and maybe you can actually find a copy of the book yourself. It should be available at most book outlets. Also, if you want to support me in any way, all that information will be in the description below, along with a link to our Discord server. Anyways, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.